Welcome to Higher Ed Matters. I'm Josh Bestromwitz, and I'm thrilled to have a former colleague of mine, Stephanie Reed, who is the founder of Aspire2Higher and the A2H Movement. Welcome, Stephanie.
Thank you, Josh. I'm thrilled to be here. It's wonderful to see you again.
You too, you too. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Wow. So not only am I the owner and operator of Aspire2Higher, but as you mentioned, I'm a former, maybe even former recovering higher ed professional, which means I still very deeply care about higher ed issues. And a lot of my work, I think, is probably in close proximity to higher education issues. So I still work with students in my Aspire2Higher work.
Awesome.
And I'm also a DEI professional who does some consulting in DEI work in corporate spaces, and now also a local municipality is where I also function in the DEI realm. So, you know, a little bit of this and a little bit of that, but still very heavily connected to equity and issues of race and justice. And I'm always thinking about students.
That's awesome. Yeah, and I absolutely invited you here today because of the work that we did together when at our last institution. And, you know, just with everything that's going on right now, I think it's a great opportunity to have these tougher conversations. And so I really do appreciate you joining us today and sharing some of your expertise. What brought you to kind of the DEI space?
Actually, my experience in higher education brought me to DEI. I initially in the higher ed space, I was in the career development world, and I was noticing some of the disparity in the usage data, right? You know how in higher ed, we always track who's using what offices and when. And so in career services, we were obviously sort of realizing students of color, students who might be on the autism spectrum and LGBTQ plus students were not using career services. But mostly it was, I think, the largest disparity and the one that I think at that time, because I was in higher a really long time ago, and career services, it was more sort of a worry about the racial disparities. Why was it that students of color were not seeking assistance from career services offices? And so then I started to do more work for these campuses where I was helping them with retention initiatives that they were developing, because at that time, again, I'm old, so a long time ago, we were just creating retention practices in higher education. So in that work, I became just, I guess, automatically tapped for some of that work. And I realized that I was quite passionate about it and was maybe even a little skilled at it. And so that led me to apply for a DEI role that became available in the institution where I was working. And I've been here ever since. And you can't pull me away from DEI if you tried.
That's awesome. That's fantastic. I know once higher education and as a whole kind of gets their hook stuck in you and you're helping students, I mean, it's such an impactful role. So thank you. So let's talk about, you kind of mentioned, I think I've also been in higher education for quite a long time. And obviously there was, I feel like this kind of creation movement, right, with DEI and seeing it really start to cross over into not just the student services, but admissions and so forth. And honestly, with the recent events, and obviously we know with affirmative action being shot down through the Supreme Court recently over the summer, it feels like we're going backwards a little bit. It feels like, you know, we are, and it's ironic, I guess, that it is the 60th anniversary of the March on Washington.
Wow.
And I don't know. There's like a heaviness, I guess, in my heart that like just sitting where kind of we're going to. So in your opinion, how do you think that we got here?
Wow.
And I know, big question. A lot of different facets.
But when I think about it, and when I answer this question, I usually preface it by saying, I'm using my own personal lens to answer this question, right?
Sure.
And my lens is now very much a DEI lens. So I honestly think we got here because the DEI work that was happening was effective, right? I think that people started to see diverse campuses. People started to see some power shifting in certain places. And I think we are seeing a resistance to change because of really good DEI interventions that have been put in place previously. Again, that's just my lens because I've been working in DEI specifically in higher education for a number of years. So I think we arrived here out of a knee-jerk reaction and a little fear. And obviously, I'm sure we'll talk about this in the episode together, but this idea of anti-wokeness, it's so absurd to me, but nonetheless, I do think that those are some of the reasons that we have arrived here. Aside from the, data supported reasons, right? We know our country demographically is shifting. By 2050, it's going to be a majority minority country. So that is a more academic reason. But my personal observations are that, it's a fear-based set of decisions.
But honestly, I hadn't thought of it in that perspective, in terms of we're here because the work that has happened within DEI was fantastic. And that does bring me a little bit of joy, I guess. Like it's hard to kind of see what's going on in the news and really in particular states. And like you said, we'll discuss this. But that does kind of lift my spirits a little bit, that this is the direct effect, or possibly the direct effect of really good DEI policies and procedures, and seeing it go across campus and so forth. So thank you for that. I do appreciate that.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to be a popular opinion, but it's just like I said, I think it's point.
No, I think I would, when you look at it from that lens, it makes total sense that when you start to see change is when people become
right.
effective. Like that's when they are going to make a decision on which direction they want to go into.
Exactly.
No, so you mentioned wokeness.
Yes.
And I would love to get your take, because it seems like folks that they would consider themselves anti-wokeness or anti-woke, but they have a hard time defining it. And I've not seen anybody really define wokeness that they then can disagree with. So in your perspective, obviously in your kind of view, what is woke?
So and it's hard for me to not do this. I try not to speak in really highly complex, academic terms.
Sure.
Go figure, right? Being a higher ed professional. But I really like to break things down for people into sort of bite-sized, consumable bits of information. So for me, simply stated, wokeness is really a higher level of social consciousness. It's having an awareness of things like power, privilege, disadvantage, access, who has it and who doesn't. So it's a state of being aware of your place in the world, if you have more power or privilege than others, or if people are holding power, right? So anti-woke is the resistance to paying attention to those things. That's what I think wokeness and anti-wokeness is about.
Sure. I completely agree. And personally, for me, I always considered it more a verb, right? I don't think that, truly, can you ever be 100% truly woke or truly anti-woke, right?
Right.
It's always, for me anyway, and again, it's my lens, my perspective from what I've experienced as well too, I think it's that drive to want to be more aware, right? Like it's always this just concern of being empathetic, to understand what it may be to experience something different that maybe you weren't raised in, or your culture wasn't experiencing, and so forth. So for me, it's always been like, I'm like, it's not necessarily like you're not, for me, again, it's not you are or you aren't, it's more of like, what is the process of with which you're woke, right? And I think that for me, that has really helped. And I have to credit you and your team and my former institution. I really grew a lot, and it challenged a lot of my thinking when I was there, and just how I process things. And for me, it's always just been a journey.
Yeah, I love to hear you say, not that I did good work when we worked together, but no, but I love to hear you say that your ideas were challenged working in a higher education environment. Go figure, right? on a college campus, we challenged your way of seeing, thinking, and engaging in the world.
Hmm.
And then you emerged on the other side, or you continue to emerge, because in
Hmm.
higher education, I would hope that we are a community of forever learners, and
Absolutely.
we're always critically analyzing and challenging the way we function in the world.
Absolutely, definitely. And I think that it's so important. I think some institutions do it really well. Others could use some help.
Sure.
But in terms of like, if you are a part of that campus community, you are a learner, you are, or you should be. Let's put it that way. Some
Right.
folks are maybe going to resist it a little bit more, but that's kind of the beauty of being on a college campus and working with students, because I feel as though that a lot of times we think that we're impacting change on students, or that we're helping them to think critically, we're expanding their ideas and so forth, and learning who they are as people.
Right.
But the magic is that we do it too. Like it's as much, I think, as
Yeah.
effective on us as it is our students.
Exactly. Exactly. People don't, and I say this, and I've been saying it a little more recently in interviews here lately, that I don't think that people give thought to the fact that students are not empty vessels in any education community, whether it's K through 12 or in higher ed. There should be an assumption that students are coming to the classroom with their own set of beliefs
Mhm.
and knowledge that they hold. And then we, as educators or administrators within the institution, we're really cultivating the knowledge that exists in them already.
Mhm.
And maybe we are also giving them new knowledge and experiences. So,
I think that's kind of, again, the beauty of higher education. I don't think, well, let's say that I feel as though, especially in states where they're starting to eliminate DEI positions in offices
right.
and things of that nature, it's this concept of almost like brainwashing.
Mm,
And if you've ever spoken to, and again, my experience, if I've anybody who works in DEI or equity or inclusion of that nature, it's almost exactly the opposite.
right.
It's a lot of question asking, a lot of expecting them to bring their experiences and so forth, and to be
Yes.
empathetic, um, versus like forcing things down students' throats, right?
Right, which is kind of the climate where we are right now. I feel like the anti woke movement and the anti DEI state that we're in is this forcing of a myopic way to
Mhm.
see the world. Or so maybe let's, if I try to give people the benefit of the doubt, maybe it's not about a singular focus, but I think here's really what I think. I think this false equivalency of equality and equity is really gotten us into trouble. And a lot of folks who are on the side of like anti wokeness or anti DEI, their arguments rely heavily on a focus on equality. If everybody just gets the exact same treatment, apply this admissions policy the exact same way, it's equal access. Okay, and that might be true, but what will the outcomes be, right, of these institutions? What will the
Sure.
institutions look like? And are we preparing students for a society where people will look different, they'll think
Mhm.
different? So yeah, I think it's a false equivalency and a heavy reliance on this idea of equalness, giving us a utopia in society. It's not gonna work.
I think that's such a great point though, because I mean, I feel as though um if we lived in a perfect world, right? Like if we had this utopia, then equality could maybe work, right? Like if we were equality, like everybody was equal. But the reality is that's not reality. We don't
Right.
live in a perfect world or utopia. And it's kind of, I mean, do we really want to though? I guess like that's my question, is the differences of what makes us human is anything from utopic. And
Yeah.
so I feel as though like by putting those ideals on it, it's just setting us up for failure.
Right.
You talked about obviously the kind of admissions decisions and the fact that now that affirmative action is off the table. I was reading in an article recently that apparently about 74% of Americans actually agreed with the removal of affirmative action. Which I think is really interesting because as you talk with institutions, I feel like it is just the exact opposite, right?
Right.
Why do you think, if this poll is accurate, why do you think that so many people would be or agree with the fact that it's been removed?
So I think it's really based in um, a large sort of misconception and a conflation of issues, right? And I have to say that my experience that I'm speaking from is limited, right? So yes, I've worked in higher education for a long time, but I wasn't an admissions professional. So
Mhm.
I don't know the intricacies and the nuances of the whole admissions process.
Sure.
But
Sure.
but what I do know is that my assumption was this admissions decisions were not race based.
Mhm.
Were they race conscious? Yes. And I think that's where the conflation of issues is coming in. I would agree potentially with the legal decision that
Mhm.
making an admissions decision based on race is discriminatory.
Sure.
Yes. Full stop. Yes. But the admissions process is not that black and white. It's not
Mhm.
that simple. So we were using race conscious
Mhm.
um, things in the admissions process, such as race factors or demographic factors. It
Mhm.
wasn't even just race, I think. So
Correct.
this is why I'm saying my knowledge of the actual admissions process is sort of a blind spot for me.
Mhm.
But in large part, I could see on the other side the impact of a more racially conscious admissions process when I was engaging students on campuses.
Sure.
On campuses where it was more diversity, there was more innovation, it was more livelihood, if that's the right way to say it. It was it's much more sort of spirited campus, if you
Mhm.
will, right?
Sure. Yep.
Um, yeah, there was just a lot of things to engage in. And then my mind goes to the absurdity of some of this, right?
Mhm.
Because now we are using this broad brush stroke to make decisions for all of higher education. So that makes me go, okay, folks. So if you're an alum from a, all female college, now are you saying that your former institution should no longer discriminate against men? Is this
Mhm.
is this how we're going to apply this ruling? I just wish that people would be a bit more critical in their analysis of a problem that is so complex.
I could not agree more. And I mean, and even going to, and this probably is going to be an unpopular opinion, but even alumni having children
Mhm.
and then getting special treatment within the admissions
Right,
office
right,
because that they are an alum. And
right,
I'm not saying that we need to get rid of it or that we should keep it. I'm not saying any of those things, but I'm like, we need to take a hard look at what factors we do take into consideration when we are admitting a student.
right,
And I agree. I think that it decisions weren't, or at least in my experience and my knowledge, decisions were not being made on race, but it was influencing the decision
yeah,
for all the right reasons, right? Like you'd mentioned, diversity across a campus. I have been on a few different campuses through my career. And I will say our last institution that I was at was very diverse. And
right,
it was one of the things that brought me to the institution, right? It was a selling point that, immediately out of the gate was that we don't have a population over 50%. And I was like, I want to experience that. That is
mm,
something that's just the makeup of a campus is just so different that I was like, I want to be a part of that world. I want to see what that world feels like. And again, was so very thankful for my experience there and how much I grew as a person.
right,
Um, but there's, like you mentioned, innovation. There's so much that having a diverse population in a college setting does to really, again, to either reinforce your values and your
right,
opinions or to challenge them and say, maybe what I thought I learned, or maybe what I thought I grew up in
Right.
may not be right. Maybe it's just that my lens is slightly off. Uh,
Right.
and I think that kind of almost, and you'd mentioned too, is that admissions is kind of your blind spot. I feel it's
Yeah.
kind of the same thing with the country. I think that
Good point.
very similarly, I think it was spun in a way that, again, incited fear or made it sound like it was not an equal opportunity, right?
Right. Right.
And that ultimately is, I think, kind of skewed maybe the perspective of it. Because I know that, again, higher ed, I think, just crumbled at like the thought of losing it. Uh,
Right.
and
Right.
so interesting perspective. But I also want to say too, and it's really, California did away with affirmative action, I think almost 30 years ago, if I'm not mistaken. And the data says they still had not recovered. That they
Right.
are
Right.
that they are not enrolling classes that are as diverse today as they were 30 years ago. Uh,
Mm.
so I think it's interesting to see in terms of how others can kind of utilize that data and those experiences to say, okay, well, we don't want to follow in California steps, right? We want to ensure that we're providing equal access to students across the board.
Right.
Uh, and
Or
again,
equitable access.
thank you. Yes,
Right. Right.
absolutely, absolutely. And I feel it's even similar to that of like first generation students, right? What if we take that off the table? I mean, that just
Right.
it's crazy to me.
It just takes me back to a point you were making earlier about, equal not being the goal because everyone's starting point is different.
Mhm.
And really this idea, and not only was I, a DEI professional in higher ed, but I studied higher education as my in my master's program. So thinking about the history of higher education and the way it was created, we had to move with the world, right? We
Mhm.
can't continue to use practices and policies that were developed for one time, right, in another
Mhm.
set of social norms in this modern society. We have to sort of move with the times. And unfortunately, right now, it feels like we're moving backwards towards old policies.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's actually, I'll put a plug in here for Good School Podcast. We interviewed them, or we had a session with them last year. And they do a spectacular job of detailing out kind of how our community colleges came to be, and why maybe there's some negative connotation around, attending a college or a community college or
Mhm.
technical school. So listeners, if you've not heard that podcast, definitely go check it out. It's really, really amazingly done. States are immediately being impacted, right? We know that Florida obviously is having DEI initiatives pulled daily. We're
Yeah.
probably going to see the same thing in Texas, maybe some Wisconsin. But even here in the Carolinas, I just saw that the University of South Carolina pulled the DEI out of a employee's or a colleague's title,
Yeah.
which just breaks my heart,
Right.
that it's at that point. Um, for our listeners that are, maybe in those states or in similar positions to where we fear that it's going to be coming to my state,
Right.
is there anything that they can be doing? Anything that to kind of prepare for this?
I think current DEI practitioners are going to have to continue to rely on data to make cases for their work. I think data tells a powerful story. And if we think about DEI as a practice within an organization, all of our institutions are businesses anyway.
Mhm.
And so if we connect our DEI functions and our strategies to business goals and to mission, we just have to stay steadfast. These are things that DEI professionals should be doing anyway.
Mhm.
But it sounds very sort of hopeful. But if DEI work has been managed well this whole time, you should have data to support the need. But I would also urge people, if you are a parent of a future student, or if you are a parent of a current student, to have your students really make the case, advocate for the need for this type of work. Um, it makes me think of, and as soon as the affirmative action decision came down, what I thought about was, it's going to sound a little negative perhaps, but because I lived in this world on a higher ed campus for many campuses for several years, I have seen students on the margins. I have seen the impacts of discriminatory and bias incidents on students and on the life of a campus. And so when I think of a university without any sort of support for different students,
Yeah.
it doesn't feel like it's going to be a safe campus for those students. So I urge parents and grandparents to think about, what are your students going to need? And not just students of a certain racial demographic.
Mm-hmm.
I think this kind of decision is going to impact students who are neurodiverse, students who are LGBTQ plus.
Absolutely.
It's just going to impact a lot of different intersections and identities that students hold. And to be quite honest, most of the people making these decisions are of an older thought. Mm-hmm. Students who are coming into the institutions that are going to be, making these decisions and managing these policies, the students have a much wider understanding of what equity and equality should look like anyway. So we need to be listening to these students.
I agree. I think that they are like literally screaming at us, demanding that they have this. And we see directly those results in Florida. I know with, what is it? I think New College that basically eliminated the president and immediately. And what breaks my heart is students don't know to stay or to go. And that's weird. I've read a couple articles that students are talking to each other and saying, I don't want this, right? I want to be in an institution that I feel safe at, or that values diversity, equity, and inclusion. These are the things that I want in a college education. And do I stay and fight, or do I go and have that opportunity to experience it? And there's not a good answer. I wish I had an answer that says stay and fight and do what you can. But at the same time, it's hard. It's really, really hard. And I hate it for the students.
Right. Yeah, I hate it for the students, but I also hate it for the parents, because a lot of the time parents are thinking of, I'm sending my child to X school to become this thing.
Yep.
Right. They're investing financially in their students' knowledge and capacity building so that they can become employable and engaged citizens. And without a care for diversity in admissions decisions, and then without DEI supports within institutions, I wonder how people expect these students who become professionals to function in a global world. Like,
absolutely.
Make it make sense, people.
That's what I mean. And I think that the pandemic, even created a blatant view of this, right? When the world shut down literally because of the virus, and we all went remote, and we all tried to figure out this whole Zoom Teams thing, and still struggle with it today. It blatantly became clear, though, that we are no longer limited by state lines, country lines. I think a lot of folks were starting to engage with other cultures, other companies in different countries. And it really made clear that we are not necessarily just tied to an office building any longer. So it's interesting to see that our lens has really widened up.
Right.
And yet when it comes to these policies and these practices, it's like the lens is actually going down further.
Right. Right. That's why I think it speaks to the point I was making about the generational differences. Mm-hmm. Those who are senior level administrators in higher education, if you think about the fact that the Supreme Court is a lifelong appointment, right?
Yeah.
How informed are they on what is really truly impacting kids who are 7 now, who will be 17 in 10 years, what they are going to need in the classroom? Like,
absolutely.
I just right. Like, I'm sure they use, they have a staff that informs them with data and all of that. But there's nothing like knowing the student experience because you see it.
Mhm.
And I think if we leaned more on what students actually tell us they want and need, and you know what I think, Josh, ultimately, I don't know how the world is going to work, and if we can change precedent and reverse this decision. But
Mhm.
I don't think that higher education, the way it's practiced today, will be sustainable,
Nope.
considering what students who are in middle school and high school right now are wanting. They are going to, with their dollars, vote by saying, "Well, I'm not going to go here. I'm going to go there." And so institutions are going to have to figure that out.
I have been beating this drum for years.
I'll bet.
You know, the college kind of experience as a whole has not really changed, and I throw admissions into this as well. It really hasn't changed in a good couple hundred years here in the U.S. It's almost the same. You know, we add new residence halls, we add new experiences, and so forth,
Hmm.
things of that nature. But down to literally the classroom and the faculty and the 4-year degrees. I'm not saying all of it's bad. That's not what I'm saying at all. But I'm like, we really need to rethink
Yes.
what a college education looks like.
Right.
And I agree. I think it's going to be this next generation that is, they have told us, right? I don't want to work a 5-day work week. I want to be
Right.
flexible.
Right.
I want to have side hustles. I don't want to
Yes.
necessarily be working in one. Like they are changing the very fabric of what we think it is to work. And
Yeah.
even to the extent of, early in my career, I used to think that, somebody who jumped around a lot, oh, that's a red flag. So don't hire
Right.
them because they're not going to stay.
Right.
That actually is a really cool thing. Like it brings you a lot of different experiences. I mean, there's so many good things. So I think it's interesting that you mentioned this generational gap because I always think the next generation always gets a bad rap, right? Like, I think it's important too. You mentioned that parents and families really encourage them to advocate for themselves,
Yes.
which is absolutely, I think, critical. And vote, right? Like
Yes.
that is something that we need. They need to share their voice, and even if they can get involved politically, right? Be an advocate for yourself. It doesn't have to be, it can be in your town, it can be in your school,
Right.
but really using your voice to stand up and say, no, no, we don't want this. We require this. This is something that must be in our experience moving forward.
You know, Josh, I'm glad you said that because when I think a couple of questions ago, when you asked like, what should people be doing to prepare, especially folks in particular states? If I'm honest, the first thing that came to my mind was to impact legislation and to be
Mhm.
politically active. But I stopped short of saying that because those things are also connected to how much power and access people have, and their ability to take time away from making money in order to be politically active. So I wanted to center my answer on something that people could do that wouldn't require, a risk on their part. Because
Sure.
sometimes political activity for certain populations is a risk.
Mhm. Absolutely. And I think that's a great point to bring up is that some just don't have that capability to do so. They don't have, again, it goes back to the whole conversation of equality and access
Yes.
is that in order to enact change, you have to have the ability to where you can, right? And for those that, are working regularly, it's just, yeah.
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly.
I think that's a great point. So obviously we're sitting in this right now. We're seeing things kind of roll out. What do you feel moving forward will be the impact of said legislation and policies that are created that want to limit or even eliminate DEI within the college campus?
So I think my idea of how this is going to continue to impact is that it will be twofold, right? We'll see a continuation of a reversal or a covering of DEI as it currently exists. Institutions will, if they don't do away with DEI, they'll call it something else and move it in another department. And I also think, unfortunately, universities are going to start looking different.
Mhm.
And that's going to impact the student experience. which leads me to my second thought. There are going to be swaths of students who feel left out. If DEI departments don't exist on campuses, they will be unsupported. I happen to think that those things will actually increase the risk for institutions for more liability for things like discrimination or hostile learning or working environments. Like, people don't understand that when there are no interventions that are race conscious, then it leaves more room for us to risk people feeling like they are being discriminated against or that bias is present in their educational experience. Or again, I think about not just the students who attend these college campuses, but people who work on these college campuses.
Sure.
We have to take into account the identities of people on these campuses because it impacts how these organizations and campuses function.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And kind of to bring it full circle, you know, like you'd mentioned that really where we're at today is really a direct effect of the success that DEI has had. You know, when you start denying folks what they feel that they deserve, or that they want and they need in these experiences, it almost, in my situations that I've seen, it ignites a fire. And so it's one of those things that I feel as though I'm putting a lot of faith in this next generation, but I think that it may actually come back to be something that they can't control at that point, right? Like, they're going to be, that students are going to demand it and are going to say, fine, if you're not willing to give us what we need, we're going to go and create it. We're going to go and do it. And it's going to come back with a fury that they won't be able to stop. And so I'm hopeful, and that it just kind of feels a little dark right now, but I genuinely believe that they'll find their way.
Yeah, let's hope so.
Well, Stephanie, thank you so much. It's wonderful to see you again and have these conversations. And I really appreciate your guidance and your experiences and the work that you do for students and of course for colleagues like myself.
I first of all, I'm just really enamored to be back in a space with you and talking about these things. And so I appreciate the ask, and I look forward to us, continuing the good fight.
Absolutely.
On behalf of students, but also on behalf of the future workforce, because we've got to keep this conversation in the forefront so that we can make a difference in what our world will look like in a few more years.